Every guitarist knows the name Gibson. The guitar company behind that name is stranger, messier, and considerably darker than anything printed on a spec sheet or a reissue box. Almost nobody knows what the company actually did to the man who invented it, or how close that same company came to disappearing entirely, or why its lawyers are still showing up in courtrooms today over nothing more than the shape of a headstock. Once you know it, it's hard to look at a Les Paul quite the same way again. If you love content that pulls apart the messy, contradictory history hiding behind a famous logo, hit the subscribe button because it helps these videos reach the players who want the real story, not just the marketing version. Start with the man whose name is on the headstock. Orville Gibson moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan around 1880, and by the mid-1890s, he was building mandolins and guitars out of a one-room workshop using a method almost nobody else in the industry used. Instead of bending thin strips of wood to shape the sides of an instrument, the way most makers did, Gibson carved his tops, backs, and sides from solid blocks of wood, the same basic approach used to make a violin. The resulting instruments were louder, more durable, and different enough that musicians started demanding more of them than one man working alone could ever produce. That success is exactly what ended Orville Gibson's control over his own company. In October of 1902, 5 Kalamazoo businessmen, mostly lawyers and music retailers, met with Gibson to form the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company Limited, incorporated with $12,000 in capital, split into 1,200 shares at $10 each. Orville Gibson sold the rights to his own name and his patents to the new company. In exchange, he received a payment for those rights, agreed to spend 2 years training the company's workers in his construction methods, and was promised ongoing royalty payments. Here's the part that tends to get lost in the official company history. Orville Gibson's name was barely even listed on the incorporation paperwork. He wasn't a controlling partner in a business built entirely around his own instruments and his own name. Within months, the new company had already started abandoning his signature one-piece carved construction in favor of faster, cheaper, bent wood manufacturing, the exact method Gibson had built his reputation by rejecting. The board eventually settled on paying him a fixed monthly amount, later formalized around 1908 at roughly $42 a month, a fraction of what the company he'd started was now worth as it scaled production far beyond anything he'd ever built by hand. Gibson's health was already declining by the time the company bearing his name was finding its commercial footing without him. Contemporary medical records describe a chronic illness, weight loss, and possibly a mental health condition, though the details from more than a century ago are incomplete. He kept working on other inventions and even spent time listed as a music teacher, increasingly disconnected from the business carrying his own name. Orville Gibson died in August of 1918 from endocarditis, a heart condition, still receiving that same modest monthly check. He never saw the Les Paul, the SG, the Flying V, or any of the instruments that would eventually make Gibson one of the most recognized names in the history of music. The company had already moved on without him, decades before any of those guitars existed. The irony is that the company thrived precisely because it moved on without him. Through the 1920s, under designers and craftsmen who came after Orville, Gibson built the archtop guitars and mandolins that made the brand's reputation in the first place, refining the exact bent wood, mass production methods Orville had spent his career rejecting. One of the key figures in that era was Lloyd Loar, Gibson's acoustic engineer and mandolin designer, whose instruments like the F5 mandolin are still considered benchmarks of American lutherie. The instruments got better, the business got bigger. The man whose name was on the headstock had almost nothing to do with either. That pattern, a name outliving the man attached to it, and a company treating its own origins as a footnote to work around rather than a legacy to protect, would echo almost exactly 100 years later, when the company decided guitars alone weren't ambitious enough anymore. But first, the golden era that came in between. In the 1950s, while Fender was eating into Gibson's market share with bolt-neck solid bodies, Gibson president Ted McCarty worked with the musician Lester Polsfuss, better known as Les Paul, to develop what became the Les Paul guitar. That collaboration produced not just an iconic silhouette, but by the end of the decade, the humbucking pickups, invented by Gibson engineer Seth Lover, whose PAF design eliminated the hum of earlier single-coil pickups and defined the sound most people still associate with a Gibson electric. McCarty's tenure also gave the world the ES-335, the semi-hollow electric that expanded what a Gibson could sound like, and the Explorer and Flying V, the radical shapes that would eventually become the center of Gibson's most aggressive trademark fights. By around 2011, Gibson was being run by CEO Henry Juskowitz, and Juskowitz had a theory. If Gibson could stop thinking of itself as just a guitar maker and start thinking of itself as a full lifestyle audio company, it could grow far beyond anything guitars alone could ever generate. The strategy was ambitious. It was also funded almost entirely with borrowed money. It started with the Stanton Group, bringing KRK Systems studio monitors, Cerwin-Vega speakers, and Stanton DJ equipment under the Gibson umbrella. Then came a majority stake in Onkyo, the Japanese home audio and AV receiver company, along with its Integra brand. Around the same time, Gibson picked up a majority stake in TEAC Corporation, adding Tascam recording gear and the high-end esoteric audio brand to the portfolio. In 2013, Gibson formally created a new parent company, Gibson Brands Incorporated, to house this rapidly growing collection alongside its actual guitar brands like Epiphone, Kramer, and Steinberger. Leadership openly talked about the goal of becoming the largest music and sound technology company in the world, a phrase that says a lot about how far the ambition had drifted from making guitars. Then, in 2014, Gibson spent $135 million acquiring Wook's Innovations from Philips, a consumer electronics division making headphones, speakers, and audio docks under the Philips name. That business became Gibson Innovations, and it was, by a wide margin, the biggest and most complicated piece of the whole expansion. Along the way, Gibson Brands also picked up smaller, stranger pieces of software and hardware almost nobody associated with a guitar company, including the recording software Cakewalk Sonar, a digital audio workstation with its own loyal user base that had nothing to do with electric guitars at all. Using debt to acquire fast-growing companies can work if those companies actually grow fast enough afterward to pay down what was borrowed to buy them. That is not what happened here. The audio and consumer electronics side of the business struggled badly, and in one particularly rough quarter before the collapse, consumer electronics sales fell by 28%, while profits in that division crashed by more than 50%. Meanwhile, the actual guitar-making side of the business, the unglamorous part nobody was building a lifestyle brand around, saw sales dip a comparatively mild 7% to $77 million for the quarter, and still posted higher operating earnings than the electronics side. The core guitar business Gibson had spent years trying to diversify away from was quietly the healthiest part of the whole company. The first real sign of trouble surfaced in November of 2017, months before any bankruptcy filing, when Gibson quietly announced it was ceasing all development on Cakewalk, the recording software business it had bought back in 2013. Cakewalk's flagship Sonar software had a genuinely loyal user base, and shutting it down looked less like a strategic pivot and more like a company already scrambling to cut costs anywhere it could find them. 3 months later, in February of 2018, a Singapore-based company called BandLab Technologies bought Cakewalk's intellectual property outright, rescuing the software from the graveyard, just as Gibson's larger financial problems were becoming public. By early 2018, Gibson Brands owed roughly $500 million to creditors, including major lenders like Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, Silver Point Capital, and Melody Capital Partners. In May of that year, Gibson Brands filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, one of the most recognizable names in music instrument history, suddenly facing the same restructuring process as struggling retail chains. The company survived, but only by cutting almost everything that wasn't a guitar. Gibson filed plans to liquidate the Philips-branded consumer electronics business entirely, winding it down across the United States, Hong Kong, and 6 European countries. Onkyo, TEAC, and the rest of the audio empire were spun off, sold, or simply abandoned. For dealers who had spent years selling guitars alongside Gibson's growing catalog of speakers and headphones, the bankruptcy meant months of uncertainty about which parts of the company would even still exist by the time the paperwork settled. Gibson emerged from bankruptcy later that year under a new ownership group led by the investment firm KKR, refocused entirely on the instruments the company had always actually been good at making. Gibson survived that scare by cutting almost everything that wasn't a guitar. But shedding an audio empire didn't mean the company stopped spending money on fights that had nothing to do with building a better instrument. Some of that same appetite for aggressive expansion and control just got redirected somewhere much smaller, toward the handful of luthiers building guitars a few hundred at a time in workshops nowhere near Gibson's scale. That legal instinct goes back much further than the bankruptcy, all the way to 1977, when Gibson's then parent company Norlin sued a company called Elgar, better known by its brand name, Ibanez, over a headstock shape. Ibanez guitars were showing up with the same open book headstock Gibson had used since the 1920s, and after cease and desist letters went nowhere, Norlin filed suit in federal court. Ibanez settled without a trial, agreeing to drop that headstock shape. The guitars built before the settlement became so collectible that players call that era of Japanese-built instruments lawsuit guitars today, decades after the case faded into a footnote. That set the template Gibson would follow again and again. Threaten, settle quietly if possible, and let each settlement expand the argument for the next fight. It also matters what kind of legal claim Gibson has been making. It isn't a patent, which would have expired after 20 years, and it isn't a copyright either. It's something called trade dress, a category of trademark law that protects a product's overall look once that look becomes closely tied to a specific brand, the same legal theory that protects the shape of a Coca-Cola bottle. Trade dress can theoretically last forever, but only if the owner keeps actively defending it, because a shape copied by too many companies for too long can eventually be ruled generic. That single requirement, defend the mark or risk losing it, is arguably the real engine behind everything that follows. In 2000, Paul Reed Smith released the Single Cut, a guitar close enough in silhouette to a Les Paul that Gibson sued for trademark infringement. A federal judge in Nashville agreed, and in July of 2004 issued a permanent injunction forcing PRS to stop making the Single Cut entirely. PRS appealed, and in September of 2005, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling, finding Gibson's trademark only covered a narrow two-dimensional outline, not an entire modern guitar. Gibson took it to the Supreme Court. Denied. Gibson had lost at every level that mattered, after already forcing a real competitor to halt production for a year. PRS later split the design into two related models still sold today, the 245 and the 250. The fight with Dean and Luna showed that loss didn't change Gibson's approach. In 2019, Gibson sued Armadillo Distribution, the company behind both brands, over the Flying V, Explorer, SG, and ES body shapes, plus the Dovewing headstock and the Hummingbird acoustic outline. A jury sided with Gibson in 2022, ruling the shapes were valid trademarks rather than generic designs, but the damages came to $4,000 against the $7 million Gibson had sought, and the case still wasn't fully resolved after an appeals court found evidence had been wrongly excluded at trial. That same year, the European Union's General Court had already rejected Gibson's attempt to trademark the Flying V shape internationally. And Gibson doesn't only chase companies making obvious mass-market copies. It has opposed a trademark application from Collings Guitars, a small Texas boutique builder, over a headstock shape Collings designed itself, and sent cease and desist letters to Kiesel Guitars over model shapes and to Satellite Amplifiers over the name Coronet, an old Gibson model most players have never heard of. None of these are counterfeit operations. They're small builders, often people who grew up idolizing the instruments Gibson made famous, and the legal letters keep arriving anyway. Line those three chapters up, and a pattern starts to look less like coincidence and more like character. Control the name, control the shape, control the story. Even when the person who built the thing gets pushed out of the picture. A founder pushed out almost as soon as his methods became viable. A leadership team that nearly sank the company, chasing stereo speakers instead of guitars. And underneath both, a decades-long habit of fighting for shape and outline. Orville Gibson learned that lesson within months of signing his company away. Small builders have learned it since. If you want more of the real history behind the guitars everyone thinks they know, hit the subscribe button, because it helps these videos reach the players who'd rather know the whole story than the marketing version.